Good evening, Mayor, council members, administrators. I'm back. My name is Lee Coggins, along with James Stahl. We're citizens as part of the Drainage Subcommittee, here to give you a status from back from October when we were first here. Tonight, we're going to tell you about the next phase we're into. Previously, we gave you a lot of data, a lot of information. That's because in the Six Sigma process we adapted, it was the data analysis phase. It was the data collection phase and data gathering phase. Now we're in the analysis phase. And what we want to share with you tonight, or several things, is that point out to you that we're using mathematics and physics to trying to find a good solution to our problem of drainage and flooding in Friendswood, and also that as we're troubleshooting this problem, there's a lot of interesting information and challenges this committee is encountering, and we'd like to share some of that information with you as well. But as I stated before, we're in the analysis phase, and rather than just grabbing solutions off mid-air, there's a scheme to our process that is actually using facts and laws of physics. Okay, we're to start things out to help solve things. We're actually using formulas, in which I'll go over one specific formula tonight to share with you. Also, once we get some analysis done or scenarios and mitigation plans going, we're going to use and test and validate and verify that with the model that Dr. Bedient is providing us from Rice that we've invested in. So once that model is verified, we'll definitely make use of it to come up with sound solutions. But first of all, I need to show a definition of what different creek levels are like, or what we define as creek levels. We need these definitions to understand how to manage the floodwaters. A good example of this is take a cross-sectional area of a creek. In our case, it's Clear Creek. In these definitions, there's different zones, 5 of them. Ideally, in the blue, zones A and B, we want the water to stay within the banks of Clear Creek. Fortunately, during heavy rains, that's not possible. So when it rains and goes over the banks, it goes into the floodway, okay? Unfortunately, there are homes in Friendswood that are in the floodway. To help us out with that is we have on the right-hand side of this diagram approximately, or an estimate of the number or percentage of homes that are in this zone. I give credit to Mr. Kabari, your city manager, for coming up with these estimates. These are estimates based on going over a lot of information about which homes are flooded and which homes were not. So it's about 50%. Today, you can't build in a floodway, okay? It's against regulation to build in a floodway for obvious reasons. The next level is the flood zone. This is the 100-year floodplain, or your chance of getting flooded in a given year of 1%. If you build in this area, it's a requirement to have flood insurance. The homes here is about 30%. And then if you're outside the flood zone, you're in near the creek, like in Harvey, like myself, near the creek, lots of rain, or street flooding occurs. The homes that were flooded during Harvey was about 20%, okay? But in these areas that if you build today, you pour concrete or build structures, you got to mitigate using that land by possibly doing some detention. So there's no requirement that's left untouched when it comes to building in a flood-prone area. The interesting thing about this slide as a citizen, and a flood victim myself, is 30 years ago we were still building in floodways, which is pretty interesting. And regulations really didn't start taking place until about 30 years ago in the 90s. That's telling me that we're way behind on the power curve, way behind, because all the development that has taken place over the 30 years and the development to come. Just look at the 45 corridor. Look all that land that's going to be developed in the coming years. So we got to get ahead on this game and come with solutions in implementing them. Okay, now that we have the different levels of the flood defined, let's look at the mathematics I promised that we would look at. This is the water balance equation we'll be using or have been using. It's a rate equation, okay? I need you to think in quantity over time. Here I'd like to use my bathtub analogy like I did last presentation. Is on the left side of the equation, this is your input. This is your faucet for your bathtub, okay? You're putting so much water into your bathtub over a certain amount of time. On the right-hand side is your output rate, okay? This is your drain. This is the amount of water you're draining out of your bathtub over time. Now, if the faucet is at the same rate as your drainage rate, the water level in your bathtub will remain the same. Simply, the same thing is with the creek. If you put the same amount of water in the creek as the same amount of water leaves the creek, your water level of the creek will stay steady. But unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. There are several variables involved. And on the input side, we got the precipitation or the amount of rain that comes down in our watershed. And then where it rains is the area. Then on the right side of the equation is a very interesting term called evapotranspiration, which is simply the amount of water that's soaked into the ground or the amount of water that's evaporated into the air. And of course, then you got the rate in which the water is moving downstream, and then what's called change in storage. This is where instead of going directly into the creek, it may be stored in such as overflow ponds, detention ponds, reservoirs, even your backyard puddles will retain some of this rain. So now that we got the equation, let's go in a little more detail on all these different variables. These three variables I need to point out is that unfortunately we do not have much control. These are the driving factors in helping us find solutions. For instance, P, the participation, the amount of rain, that's all governed by rules of nature, Mother Nature. We cannot control the participation. We can forecast the participation, but how much actually falls, we don't have control over that. Same with the watershed area. We don't have, it's governed by Mother Nature as far as the elevations. And as a reminder from last presentation in October, the water we get in Clear Creek in the Friendswood area comes from us from outside of Friendswood at about 90%.
Now, how did you come up with 90%? I'm a little bit, so during Harvey, you're saying 10% came from Mother Nature right pouring down rain on us.
You remember the map I showed of the area of the watershed? In comparison of how small Friendswood in the rest of the watershed? So it's area.
Oh, area. Oh, just
simply area.
Not really knowing what Mother Nature
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
does on us.
Right. Of course, if it very local rains and heavy rains, that will make a difference depending on where your heavy rains lie. But if you take it on the average of a constant rainfall across this area, that's where it comes from.
They're basing the flow based on the gauges that were read at various points along the creek, as well as knowing the various tributaries that go into Clear Creek from Pearland and Houston.
Okay. And then E, this lovely term of evapotranspiration, what goes into the ground, what's evaporated, that's very insignificant, very small number. I would have loved the first night or one of the nights of Harvey of 18 inches that all that would have gone into the ground or evaporated in the air, but that didn't happen. So we really can't, that doesn't play too much of a part in our equation, in our analysis. What we do have the ability to control or change or play with are two variables. If you take out the E, take out the P and the A, that leaves, of course, the R, which is the rate, and the change in storage. So let's look into the rate in a little more detail. The rate is simply, as definition, is the speed and volume of water that moves downstream of the creek. This picture best illustrates, it's a picture I took back in June in Minnesota, specifically of Rochester, Minnesota. It's the December River. Kind of summarizes many of these components. For one thing, you can, to help increase the velocity, you can straighten the creek. That is, take all the curves and the banks. That way the water is not hitting land. It has a nice straight flow through to the outlet. Channelization, you widen it. As the picture shows, it allows you to move a lot more volume faster. And then if you remove vegetation, get rid of the trees, the bushes, the grasses, it's a friction effect that if you eliminate or reduce the friction, the water, of course, will flow fast, just like airflow over an airplane wing. So that's one way you can control this. And then, of course, the other thing is you can create more branches to move the water out faster. And other factors that play into this is obstructions downstream. Let's say you have buildings in the way or bridges can cause restrictions, or playground equipment, whatever the case may be, that will decrease the flow downstream. And then also playing into this is, since we get hurricanes and tropical storms around here, is the storm surge. However, storm surges historically hasn't been the source of our flooding, really. Storm surges come in the first day of a storm, hurricane, brings the levels up, and usually as the eye of the storm passes through it, the surges go down, and what's left is the amount of rain we get, and that rain coming into the watershed and coming into the creek. Like for Harvey, I know storm surge wasn't an issue. What was the issue is the amount of rain. As we saw in our last presentation, is we get a lot of rain in this Gulf Coast area, more so than what's predicted. So there's many remedies we can look at, and we'll be considering and plugging into the model. Next, I'll have James Stahl talk about Delta S, and I'll let him come up and speak on Delta S.
Council members, I can hear the children start coming here, so I feel like every time we come, it's children coming in, and which is maybe a good move by you guys. Like, here's all the bad news. Oh, look, children. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we can store it. So detention, both inline and offline. You can shelving, or you can creating increased area of the floodways. You can create reservoirs by damming, so we could just create a huge dam and stop all the water coming from Pearland, and then leave it to other people. There's a Pearland folks here. And then we can increase the creek height through levees or other means. We can do channel widening, which would allow us to hold more water. And then we can increase the absorption into the soil, which we always laugh about. There's really no way that we're going to be able to do that down here. But I guess in other areas, that's something that can be done. And then all of this, all mitigations, I mean, they provide positive impact, but only to a point. Eventually, you're going to overflow the bathtub. And so you've got to figure out a way to move the water. And so just kind of keep that in mind. So if you remember last time we spoke, Dr. Bedient was in. They were doing, the Rice team is doing some studies, and they're going to be working on some things. They have a validation model, if you will, against some of the data from Harvey. They'll be determining the effects of the following: the desnagging, the bridges, bypass channeling, outlet to the ocean, and an inline detention. So those are just some of the main things that we're asking him to look at. And basically, he's going to come back and give us information about that. Let us know what would happen if you do those things, and then what series of things do you need to compound on top of each other. When we actually do come with a full-out recommendation, we feel it'll be necessary to, obviously you got to have the essential engineering. It won't have a final design. but it'll show the effectiveness of each option. We will try to take into account, or at least make mention of the estimated costs. Obviously, we don't know what the final cost would be, but the initial estimates, the design, scope, work, and land purchases that are aligned with that. And then as well, we'll try to discuss some of the legal, environmental, and political complications that'll exist for any of these things. For example, the joke that I just said, that we're going to dam it up, and that's a really good idea until you start to play with those types of things, and then you run into some other problems. We are still not formulating or presenting a specific recommendation, but we are making sure that we just want to go over, and we talked about it in the last meeting, and I heard it again. You know, we're the LMI. We're seeing that issue. It's common in the GLO requirements when it relates to that. We understand also, and we want to make sure everybody that y'all are aware of it, that many of the things that are being done upstream and all of the other things that are quote unquote good for the community and the environment and the areas dealing with flooding, all of this work is based on typically a 1% model. So they are only trying to stop a 1% storm, and as we know, Harvey was not that. And we're paying close attention to the right-of-way and housing buyout programs, and ongoing recommendations will likely feature some of these things. We have been in contact with Jamie Lynn Sipinowski. Did I get it? Almost. She's doing a study on the effects of sound walls and if they created more flooding. And there are no studies that exist for this. She's one of the first people to do this, and we obviously have some sound walls, so we're taking a high level of interest in that. Jonah Chen from the GLO has joined our team as a permanent member, and the Galveston County Commissioners are actively looking at generating county money for desnagging Clear Creek and can tie into Houston and state federal money to clear both sides of the creek. We may have more scenarios, like I mentioned a couple slides ago, that Dr. Beatty would have to do, which means that we may come back to City Council for an addendum, which I guess means money. And then we hope to have our final recommendations sometime in March.
Now, when you get to your final recommendations, will there actually be plans that we could present to the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the General Land Office and the Galveston County Commissioner's Office? Will we have actual recommendations and plans with possible costs? I heard you say that they would be estimates, or would we have a working plan?
So I'll take a stab at this, and then the resident experts will jump in here. We are going to look at a lot of different things, and we're going to try to do a few recommendations. So as community members, we're going to say, as a group, this is what we think based on all the information that we've gotten. Here's what we estimate cost. Here's what we estimate the plan, what it's going to take. It's my understanding that we don't have the authority to actually submit anything of that nature. We can only give a resource to you that you guys would then decide what you're going to have to submit.
Well, I just mentioned that because we have had studies done from many, many, many years, and we had some opportunities for some on-the-shelf type projects. We really need some very good data and updated projects that we can actually physically take to these various agencies so that they can see where Friendswood's coming from, where the Clear Creek watershed is in Friendswood, and how we can do conveyance. And I was really surprised to see the Delta storage, that y'all added that as a positive, because I know a lot of people don't think storage is really worth the time, but it was a plus, so I was glad to see that. But we really need to see something that we can take shelf ready.
Well, and I will say that we have broached the subject with the Army Corps of Engineers. They attended one of our subcommittee meetings, and continual talks still take place with our elected officials at the state and federal levels about seeking CAP funding from the Corps, and forgive me, I don't know the acronym off the top of my head this evening, but is to secure funds to evaluate these other potential projects in Friendswood along the Clear Creek watershed. And this will allow us to identify those shovel-ready projects so that we're not out of sight, out of mind.
We want to give you as much as we can. I promise you that. But there are obviously limits to what we can provide.
Carl.
I think it's important to recognize, too, that the committee is not an engineering entity, and so they're going to be limited as to what they can do. I think the intent is that there'll be recommendations that'll be such that staff can format them in such a way to provide them to whatever agency holds the funding that we're looking for, and that they'll be conceptual in nature, but that's generally what the project scopes look like early on at the funding end. And keep in mind, they're not funded entirely. Initially, there's going to be a funding request for a study. And once the study's complete, then there's going to be a funding request for either more study or begin acquiring property, and then another funding round for actually beginning to do the construction after the there'll be another funding request for engineering, then another funding request for doing the work. So the funding won't be, okay, we need to go raise this bridge over here, and we need $40 million to do it. It's going to be, we want to raise this bridge over here, but we need, there needs to be a study to get a handle on what the costs are going to be, develop an estimate. Then there'll be another request to do the engineering, and then there'll be another request to actually do the work. Once the engineering's complete, you've actually got a hard plus or minus 10% estimate. So.
Just to answer, we believe that the recommendations we're going to give are very actionable. We want to give council stuff that they can then go to work on.
I think close to what you're looking for, and not 100%, will be the finalized product of the Rice study from Dr. Bedian. I think you're going to have the data necessary that you can use that in grant programs. You're going to be able to make recommendations and do that. As a committee, we're going to recommend to you, but we will not move that forward. But you guys will have the data and the things that you need to make that recommendation.
Well, I'm not on the committee, but I've heard some very nice things about possibly widening choke points where bridges are and how wide they actually need to be to flow water. And that's the kind of stuff that we're going to need, because that will give us actionable material.
Thanks a lot, James, Lee. You guys are doing great work. I appreciate all of you that are serving on this subcommittee. Councilmember Rocky, Councilmember Gustafson, Lee Coggins, James Stahl, Jonah Chen, thanks for stepping up. Commissioner Gary Harris is here. Ron Lovely's over there. I was getting to that side of the room. Patrick is here. Patrick Donner, Mo Rod. So appreciate all of you for all the work that you've been doing since June. There's a lot of effort going into this, and we appreciate you. So yeah, every week for 6 months, so it's impressive work.
One thing that
We appreciate you.
Ken Clark is on the team, and I think him being on the team has got him energized on this, and he's been the one pushing the Galveston County Commissioners to help pay for the de-snagging, and I think that's a real positive so far that's come out of this.
Well, we knew there would be positives that came out of this, and